Today, as we heard, is the feast of Christ the King, and our gospel passage that we've just heard from Matthew's gospel recounts Jesus' telling of the parable of the sheep and the goats. Central to this story is the image of a king casting judgment from his throne. And I have no doubt in my mind that something is seriously lost in translation when we read this story and we try to map that image directly onto our own experience. It simply doesn't work. Whatever our views of hereditary parliamentary democracy, that bears no resemblance to the time when Jesus was speaking in. The kind of monarchy that we know, certainly in this country, bears no resemblance to that. The only thing that people in his age knew, in the age in which the Gospels were being written, was a life that was at the mercy of a ruler at the top. And the rule of law for them was living to please the ruler's diktat and whim. But that's all the more reason why it's astonishing how Christ overturns images of power with images of services, images of doing for our fellow others in acts of mercy, of a Christian disposition to give freely as we have freely received. For those of us who follow a Christian way, that has to redefine where our values come from. And these values must come from this picture of a kingdom and of power turned upside down. Those values will come from seeking common ground with others at the places where they are most in need. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me in. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. This doesn't mean that Christians have an advantage over other faiths when it comes to doing acts of service, but it does mean that we have a particular starting point. And it's not an individual, personal starting point, but it begins with the bigger picture. A recent study at an American university concluded that those who are members of a place of worship are much more likely than those who are not to volunteer in the community. They're also more likely to talk to someone in their community that they do not know well. Now remember, this is talking about people who gather in a synagogue, a church, or a mosque, or any other type of worship community. They're more likely to attend a community meeting or a local event, highlighting the good that can be done for the community, the bigger picture. They're also far more likely than others to feel a sense of belonging to their neighborhood, to feel connected to the people that they live among, and to turn that sense of belonging into acts of charity, of community building, and so on. We really should hear this as good news at a time when we are aware in daily world events that religion is divisive, and we learn that faith and identity with a particular faith community can be a unifying force. So yes, we know that faith fused with politics, faith fused with ideology can create what Pope Francis recently referred to as a climate of closure, meaning a climate of conformity, of groupthink. But as this study shows, faith communities can also help people to think for themselves, to drive by a different set of values than they find elsewhere. And that means thinking not just about ourselves, but thinking of others, and learning to care for the well-being and the flourishing of those around us. And so faith can broaden our spirit, embolden us to, out of complacency and out of a sense of being overwhelmed by the state of despair that we see in so many corners of the world. We can both think for ourselves and we can do for our community. We can both know that the actions we do when we are community-minded are good in themselves, but also that we find personal fulfillment in doing them and in doing them in the company of others. So think about how singing together here on a Sunday or on a Tuesday, or thinking together through a passage of Scripture in a sermon, or finding common ground with one another as we gather to share communion. Solidarity all at once in the sacrament of Christ's body that we received in bread and wine. Think about how this habit of turning up week on week becomes a rehearsal for the kind of life we want to live, for the kind of people we want to be. Think about how this helps us to do things together, to plan things out, to step out in faith, and to risk going a little farther. And so I think we should be hugely hopeful for our growing links with the Church of All St. Pancras. Think about how we might find common ways to share Christ's healing vision that says, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are my family to me, you did it to me." But what about this troubling image of the king in this story, depicted as casting judgment from the throne? "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." Well, there you are. Jesus doesn't give us palliatives, doesn't give us things to make us feel good about ourselves in the midst of a suffering world. But he gives us something else. He gives us something he calls us to. The calling to inhabit a world in pain and to meet people in their suffering. Now here's the way I think this passage works, this story of the sheep and the goats. When you watch a film and you're in the middle of a scene and you see the camera pulling back away from this scene, away from that central focus point, and as it does that, the camera reveals the wider scope of the environment that surrounds that individual in the scene. And suddenly, this open scope, this widening vision, you begin to see who else is in the scene, and you see where the scene is set, and you see what is taking place around it. And of course, if the lens pulls way back, you suddenly see what matters is not the individual details on the ground. What matters is the fact that we can see the whole scene in a single frame. So there's a kind of storytelling in the Bible that is the equivalent of that long shot, that wide scope lensing of a film. We call it eschatology. And that word, eschatology, literally means future orientated. It means moving towards the end. And all it means is that in the stories of Jesus, that scene gives you a panoramic view of life from beginning to end, like that sort of extreme wide shot in cinema. And like a film reel spooling out of a projector, it shows you how everything is moving towards a final resolution. But the point of that, and what you're supposed to see in the whole of life moving towards God's future, is that we're supposed to see how our own actions, our own lives are plotted along that path. And they're leading towards a final judgment filled with hope. The story of the sheep and the goats is, in that sense, pointing towards that good end. But the problem is that we worry about the details of the story. Who are the sheep and who are the goats? Is this about how many people I was supposed to visit in hospital or in prison, or about how much we did for the hungry? Do we see Christ only in the suffering? And is that the whole list, or am I supposed to care for more than just the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the prisoner, or the sick? Or is the story about the virtue of doing good for its own sake, or about doing good when we did not know we were doing good? Of course, it's all the worse if we read the passage as a recipe for racking up merit badges in heaven. But Christ's parable is not about earning our way to heaven. And no, the list isn't exhaustive. And thank God the story telescopes out and simply opts out of our religious anxieties altogether. Instead, it says to us, God's kingdom values are rooted in justice and in the arts of peacemaking, because that is the overarching story of the world God made. Justice and peace are the moral direction of travel in the life of faith. That's where we are headed in the end. That's the big picture. So where do we begin when we want to build a community of faith for the formation, the maturing, the flourishing of a Christian life? We begin with that big picture. And when we do that, we begin to hear, even from where we sit this morning, echoes of Christ's pronouncement on that final day. Come you, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared from the foundation of the world. And of course, because we have that vision from that lens pulled all the way back, the way a satellite image from space shows our planet turning on its axis, we don't just see detail, we see the two-way traffic of God's future. The promise of the future pulls us towards God's healing end. That's what motivates our action in the world. But at the same time, it's only in the very act of doing what Jesus calls us to that that future promise then becomes real to us. And so we ask ourselves, what does it look like to take seriously what Jesus says? Feed the hungry. To the thirsty, give water to drink. Visit the sick. Go to those isolated in prison. Clothe the naked. Invite the stranger in. The story of the sheep and the goats is a lens trained on the future. But that lens is also looking back at us in the present. And so those future-oriented kingdom dispositions call us to acts of mercy in the here and now, as Christ has mercy, and gives us the strength and the courage to live lives turned outwards towards love of neighbor and mercy for the stranger, as Christ lived a life of love and of mercy for neighbor and for stranger. As we move into God's future, what are the places in our lives? What are the places in your life in which you want to see God writing that kind of an ending? And so as we heard today, we're poised towards on the edge of Advent, which starts next week. Our passage today, in fact, comes as the third part of 3 parables that Jesus tells, and all are about our identity in Christ. And they come to us in striking images, some disturbing. We saw this last week in the passage of the talent, in the parable of the talents. And the week before that in the story about being ready and having your lamp always filled with oil. But today is the last piece of teaching that happens in Matthew's gospel before Matthew begins to tell us the story of Christ's passion. In fact, the very next passage after this story is subtitled, "The Plot to Kill Jesus." So there must be something really important, really crucial about the way in which the story of the sheep and the goats captures what for Matthew is the gospel of Christ, the good news that Christ came to bring to us. And so in the spirit of this good news, in the spirit of this future that begins in our present, let me close with a poem by the Pakistani poet Imtiaz Darkar, writing about a scene in her now hometown of Mumbai where a public water pipe breaks open in the heat of summer so that all people can come and share in that water, and children play in the blessings of that water. Blessing. The skin cracks like a pod. There never is enough water. Imagine the drip of it, the small splash echo in a tin mug, the voice of a kindly God. Sometimes the sudden rush of fortune, the municipal pipe bursts, silver crashes to the ground, and the flow has found a roar of tongues. From the huts, a congregation, every man, woman, child for streets around butts in with pots, brass, copper, aluminum, plastic buckets, frantic hands, and children screaming in the liquid sun, their highlights polished to perfection, flashing light as the blessing sings over their small bones.